Alright guys, so we're going to just finish up these last slides here on the adaptations to aerobic endurance training, and then we'll also get into the heat and fluid replacement stuff here too. So let's just start with this. This is where we ended off last time, talking about how with training for each sub-maximal intensity shown here, you see that you burn less carbohydrates, and as you can see on the next slide, you burn more fat. And we talked about how this is all due to the fact that you have less sympathetic nervous system stimulation at any given intensity, because exercise at each intensity is just not as much stress on the body, because it's easier for the body, and so the body can rely on more fat burning. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that you have more powerful mitochondria, and just more density of mitochondria within skeletal muscle. And this allows us to stick with the aerobic system and also stick with fat burning for longer. We don't have to use those precious energy stores of carbohydrates. And we do see a slight decrease in the amount of energy it takes to exercise in a given intensity. So very, very small, but we do see a little bit greater efficiency at each exercise intensity, and that's what you see here. It's not too big of a change, but we just become more efficient. And the main reason for this is because we're using less of our type 2 fibers and more of our type 1 fibers at any given intensity, and type 2 fibers are much less efficient than type 1 fibers, and so this is why we see that. And so another major shift that occurs that is probably one of the things that really allows us to race or perform at a higher intensity with aerobic training is this change we see in lactate threshold. And you can see here, this was the blue is before training, and you can see lactate levels on the y-axis here, and lactate is staying flat up until a certain pace of about 12 kilometers per hour. Then all of a sudden it goes up, so that point is considered lactate threshold. After training, that point where lactate starts increasing is closer to 14 kilometers per hour. Okay, and so what you see here, how that translates out to on oxygen uptake is really where it's key, because we know that the maximal sustainable oxygen uptake is going to be kind of our race pace, and really what we want to see increased. And in this case, we have VO2 max not changing, so VO2 max is around 71 mLs per kg, but we see oxygen uptake here on the y-axis and speed on the x-axis, and we can see that with this blue line, the lactate threshold is occurring right around 53 mLs per kg per minute, and which is 75% of VO2 max. But you can see after training, the lactate threshold is occurring right around 62.5 mLs per kg, which is 88% of VO2 max. And you can see a major difference in the speed. Right, so we've got about 15 kilometers per hour up to about 17 kilometers per hour. So a huge difference in the speed they're able to sustain, and this is with no increase in VO2 max. VO2 max stays exactly the same. We're just able to increase the percentage of VO2 max that we can sustain. And this is a key adaptation to endurance training. And this is just showing what exactly we see with lactate threshold. With the increase in lactate threshold, it's a combination of two things. One is a decrease in the rate of lactate appearance. Okay, and so this is lactate rate of appearance before training. This is rate of appearance post training. Okay, and what we see here is at each VO2 level, we have more lactate before training. Okay, so it appears earlier, and more of it appears earlier, and so that just means that before training, they're having to use their anaerobic systems more and producing that lactate, and they're not able to buffer it as well. And then this chart over here is lactate rate of disappearance, and the pre is this line here. And so it's higher, just like the other one, but this is disappearance. So this means that they actually get rid of lactate quicker. So rate of disappearance is up here, so this is how fast they can get rid of lactate. You can see they can get rid of lactate much quicker at each intensity. And so the combination of these two effects means lower levels of lactate all the time, And so this is really driven by two things. One is that you have you're using less anaerobic energy systems to produce ATP, and two is that you have a better ability to deal with the lactate. So part of that's better buffering capacity, part of that is better circulation. And so with those two things together, we're not making as much lactate, and the lactate that we do make, we deal with it quicker. This allows for higher lactate threshold as well as a higher maximal sustainable intensity. And this is really just showing that same idea that we're making less lactate and we're removing it quicker. And something else that, as we've been talking about, the sympathetic nervous system is related to this, and so the higher sympathetic nervous system activity is, the more blood lactate we have, and you can see this is just showing the relationship between blood lactate and blood epinephrine levels, and they pretty much go right along with each other. So the more stressful exercise is, the more anaerobic systems we use, and the more lactate we have. And so this is the same idea that we're getting back to, that with endurance training, we decrease the stress that any given exercise intensity is in the body, and so we have less epinephrine release from the medulla, or the adrenal medulla, and that's going to affect all those things. But exercise intensity is tightly linked with how much epinephrine release we have. But then after training, we have kind of a downtick of that same exercise intensity will produce less epinephrine release because exercise is less stress on the body. Okay, so just to kind of summarize what we've been talking about here, we see this increase in lactate threshold with training, which really is going to boil down to a greater percentage of our VO2 max that we can sustain for racing, which allows us to have a greater race pace and faster endurance performance. And we talked about RER and oxygen uptake. So RER, what we see here is we see a lower RER at any submaximal intensity, which means that we're burning more fat because we're able to exercise at a level that feels like less stress on the body, so the body's able to use more fat. Maximally, we actually see a higher RER. We didn't really talk about that much, but higher RER is because the body just gets used to dealing with hydrogen ions, used to dealing with lactate, and so the body starts allowing for a little bit more accumulation of those metabolites, and so the maximal RER will probably be higher after training. Oxygen uptake, we see a slightly lower submaximal oxygen uptake, and so we talked about we're becoming a little bit more efficient with each exercise intensity, and this is really due to the fact that we're using more type 1 fibers to sustain the pace that we need and less type 2 fibers. And obviously maximal oxygen uptake is going to be increased. With that increase, we see in VO2 max. Okay, so we see that increases in VO2 max plateau pretty early on in a training program, but what we see is that we can still improve performance, and this is kind of what we've been getting at. We see VO2 max rise maybe 25 to 30% with training, but we can improve our performance more than that, and that's all due to the fact that we are able to sustain a higher percentage of our VO2 max during training or during racing, and that's going to be more tightly linked to the lactate threshold. But really, that maximal sustainable intensity is going to be somewhere probably kind of right between lactate threshold and VO2 max. That's going to be somewhere right around where our maximal sustainable intensity is, and that's also known as critical power or critical velocity if you're running. Okay, and we'll just talk a little bit about some of the anaerobic adaptations that we see. And so we don't have as much ability to improve anaerobic power as we do aerobic power. Some of the highest increases we ever see in anaerobic power go up to 25%, but sometimes we don't see any changes. And so this is again measured by a Wingate test, and so that's that. And so some of the changes we do see have to do with changes in muscle fibers themselves. So some of the type 2 fibers actually have some hypertrophy, and we see some switching from the type 1 to type 2A fibers with high intensity kind of anaerobic sprint type training. We also see some improvements in some of the enzymes that run the ATP creatine phosphate system, and so we see creatine kinase activity can be increased modestly, not by a lot, but we can see some. So we see maybe a 15% increase in the creatine kinase enzyme activity, and they've done a few studies where they compare training with 6-second bouts, so repeated 6-second bouts or repeated 30-second bouts, and so this is kind of interesting because you would think that we're tapping out the creatine phosphate system the best with a 6-second bout, not with a 30-second bout. But what they see actually is they didn't really see any improvements in creatine kinase activity with the 6-second training, but they did with the 30-second training. But then there have been some other conflicting studies that have shown improvements with 5-second bouts. So we don't really know exactly the best way to do this, but it seems to be longer than 6-second bouts would probably be a little bit better for training this system. We also see some improvements in glycolytic enzymes. So these are those anaerobic enzymes, anaerobic glycolysis enzymes. And so all the enzymes listed there, phosphofructokinase is the rate-limiting enzyme for glycolysis. And so we do see improvements in that. Lactate dehydrogenase, that's at LDH, phosphorylase, all these enzymes, we've seen improvements about 10 to 50% of their activity. And so you can see here, these are the anaerobic enzymes down here. So you can see creatine kinase, untrained to anaerobically trained. We do see that little increase there in myokinase, which is important for that system as well. Phosphofructokinase, we do see a nice jump in that, and that's really important because that's the rate-limiting enzyme in glycolysis. We can't see improvements in all of these. And so then the question is, well, does this improvement in enzyme levels and enzyme activities translate to a performance change? And so back to that same study where they did 30-second versus 6-second bouts, they only saw enzyme improvement with the 30-second bouts, but the same performance improvement was seen with the 30-second bouts or the 6-second bouts. So even though they only saw creatine kinase enzymes improve with the 30-second bouts, the performance went up the same in both bouts. So the increase in performance was not linked to the increase in creatine kinase activity. So this is an area we still don't have a lot of research on, so we're not really sure exactly what's going on here. Okay, guys, so we're going to get into the exercise in the heat notes here a little bit, and we'll probably at least just go through to where the fluid replacement stuff starts at the end. Yeah, this little picture, this is from last year from Christian, but he's just so precious and those bright blue eyes. I just couldn't take it off the slides from this year. But anyways, he's a cute guy, that's for sure. All right, get into this. Okay, so one of the key things that happens with exercise is the fact that we create a lot of heat. Metabolism creates a lot of heat, and that's due to the fact that our bodies aren't perfectly efficient. And when we break this bond between the last two phosphates there on ATP, we lose a lot of it as heat. And we talked about before how we lose about at least 60% as heat, but we can lose up to 75% of that energy as heat with each ATP broken down. And so that's just internal heat that we create. So that's a lot of heat that we create with exercise. But we also have external sources, obviously the temperature, the sun. The body will absorb around 97% of the radiant energy that strikes it. So this is a lot. It's a good reason to wear a shirt. And then exercise can increase heat production to incredible extents. We can see about a 10 to 15-fold increase in heat production with exercise. And there's no other type of metabolic situation that can do anything like this in the body. But if we just look at the change in temperature of the skeletal muscle alone, we can see a 30 to 40-fold increase in heat production. So one of the major problems with exercise for the body is heat and how to deal with this heat. So luckily, humans have an incredible capacity to deal with heat, way more than any other animal in the world, and that's what we've talked about this before. But our sweat glands are hugely important for this and hugely unique to humans. So yeah, we can talk about this question here for a sec. So what state of matter has the highest energy level? Okay, and so obviously we have solid, liquid, and gas as our states of matter. And the key in understanding here is that gas has the highest state of highest energy level for the different states of matter. And so this is going to be vitally important for how sweating cools the body. Okay, so we have 4 different modes of energy transfer. Okay, and so the 4 modes of energy transfer are conduction, convection, evaporation, and radiation. Okay, so conduction means that when there's something touching the body, we're transferring heat through two objects that are touching. And so that's shown here. Conduction, shoes in contact with the turf. This can happen if you've ever played on a turf field. Those fields can get really, really hot, and that can actually transfer your body and heat you up. Convection is a similar idea to radiation, where we have something passing over the body, but what it is actually movement of air particles across the body. And so if you have any oven, if anybody has an oven at home that's a convection oven, when you turn the convection oven on, a fan turns on and blows that heat across the food. And that's what convection is movement of air particles that are warm, or at least in the case of an oven, that are hot across the body, and that's going to add heat to the body, and add heat to the food in the case of the oven. Evaporation is exactly what we've talked about with sweating, where sweat and liquid gets put on the surface of the body, and that sweat is actually turned into goes from liquid to gas. And so it's that key step where sweat is being turned from liquid to gas that requires an addition of energy. And that's why we just had that question previously: which state of matter has the most energy? Well, it's gas, and so to turn the sweat from liquid to gas requires an addition of energy, and that energy comes out of the body, and we lose a lot of energy and heat that way, which is very important. And then radiation is really for all intents and purposes in our world, sun rays touching the body and transferring energy that way. So at rest, we use radiation type of heat removal the most. And so the sun is obviously the way that energy comes into us via radiation, but we lose a lot of heat. We radiate a lot of heat out just by warm tissues and warm blood getting to the surface, and then the energy just warms up the air around us and leaves the body that way. And then the only difference with convection and radiation is that convection is when you have air moving across the body, and that is helping to pull some of the energy out. But during exercise, there's no doubt evaporation is the number one mechanism we use to get rid of heat. And so this slide is just showing how all the different mechanisms are used here as far as getting rid of heat in the skin. And so number one, we have conduction. The heat produced in the muscles, and this warms up the tissues above it. This warms up the dermis. This is the hypodermis. The dermis warms up this, and then anything that's touching the body will get pulled out. And then we have convection, which is actually air moving across the body, and that's pulling some heat out with it. And then we have radiation, where there's just energy and heat radiating off of the body, and you can feel this on yourself. After you've exercised and you put your hands over your legs, you can feel some heat radiating off of this. And then obviously the most important one for us is evaporation. These sweat particles getting turned into vapor. Okay, and so evaporation works well to get rid of heat because, the key here is that the heat required for the change in the state of matter is extracted from the body, and that's very important. And this one's also important. Going from vapor to liquid requires an addition of heat. Okay, so really the answer here is going to be E, both A and C. Okay, and this is just showing the difference between, first of all, rest. Both of these are resting state, both of these are exercise. Okay, and so these are looking at evaporation, radiation, and conduction. And you can see what we have here is a hot, wet environment, so a humid environment, and this would be a hot, dry environment. Okay, so what we can see here is at rest, we use more radiation and conduction than we do evaporation. And you can see in the hot, dry environment, we're able to use a little bit more evaporation here than we are here. And then when we go down to the exercise state, it's almost all evaporation for exercise, right? And then especially in the dry environment, it's about 90 to 95% evaporation that we use to cool the body. But when we go into the more humid environment, it's much less evaporation, and this is a key factor. And so if there's more liquid in the air, we simply can't evaporate heat as much because there's less of a pull to get that water to turn into vapor and go into the air because there's already more liquid in the air. And so it's just an issue of vapor pressure, and we can't vaporize water as well because there's already a lot of water in the air in humid environments. Okay, and so this is really a key thing in understanding here, this comprehension question. Why is heat illness so much more common when the humidity is high? Yeah, take a second to look at this. But the idea here is that evaporation does not occur as easily. And so what happens, instead of that water, that sweat that you're doing evaporating, the sweat actually just drips off of your body, and that's pretty much worthless sweat. That type of sweat doesn't help us at all. The sweat has to be evaporated in order to help us. The sweat that just drips off doesn't help us at all. Okay, so now we're going to get into a little bit about what is controlling the temperature in the body, and we know that the hypothalamus in the brain is kind of the temperature regulation center of the brain, and really it's kind of known as the body's thermostat. So there's this kind of set point in temperature that the body has, and the hypothalamus is regulating that via input from thermoreceptors all over the body, peripheral thermoreceptors as well as central thermoreceptors, and so if we have any change in heat, whether that be an increase in temperature or decrease in temperature, these thermoreceptors are sensing that, sending that signal back to the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus will respond by either increasing heat production if it's too cold, or trying to deal with that extra heat if it's too warm. And so when we look at cases of heat exhaustion, it's important to know where the hypothalamus will actually stop working. And so that's usually considered to be above 106.7 degrees Fahrenheit. That's kind of where the hypothalamus will just stop regulating temperature, and then temperature will just continually rise until death. So that's a very critical point. One of the most amazing things about this is how sensitive to changes the hypothalamus is, and that's what we see down here at the bottom. That as small as a 0.018 degree Fahrenheit change in body temperature is enough to have the hypothalamus respond and to take action on that. So very, very sensitive, very tightly controlled temperature in the body. And so this is kind of the pathway that we see for how the body responds to changes in core temperature. Okay, and so we see here is thermoreceptors from the skin, thermoreceptors from the hypothalamus, or other deep kind of core thermoreceptors are all sending their signals back via afferent neurons to the brain, and all these get integrated into thermal signals, and then we either get a signal telling the hypothalamus that it's too hot, or that it's too cold, temperature's too high or too low. And then the thermal command center really is going to send out a few different types of signals. Okay, so one would be stimulating the sweat glands to start producing sweat and releasing sweat. Obviously, that's if the temperature's too hot. We also get vasodilation in the skin arterioles, and we get vasoconstriction in superficial veins. So vasoconstriction in the veins kind of mobilizes some of the stored blood that we have in the venous system. Venous system acts as a reservoir for extra blood, so we get vasoconstriction in those veins to put some of that blood back into the regular circulation, where we get vasodilation in the skin arterioles to send blood to the skin, so that can help us deal with heat. And so this is just looking at what we've already talked about. We've seen this exact slide before, showing how much blood flow changes from rest down here in the blue to heavy exercise up here in the red. And you can see the asterisks here, which we mentioned before, is this is all very dependent on ambient and body temperatures. Okay, and so you can see the one that really is affected by that is right here in the skin. Skin can range from anywhere from 5% of the blood to 20%. And so obviously the hotter we get, the hotter the temperature is that we're exercising in, the higher this percentage of the blood flow that goes to the skin becomes. And so we see if we take some of that, if we add more blood to the skin, these other tissues have to suffer in some way. And so we have decreases in blood flow to these other tissues in the heat, because we're sending more blood to the skin to deal with to deal with the temperature increase that we have. Yeah, and so the kidneys are one of the main ones that suffer from this, and this is why exercising the heat can result in kidney stones and things like that, is because the kidneys just kind of dry up, and some of those things that are held in solution in the urine actually are allowed to crystallize because of the lack of fluid. And so this is a nice slide that just shows the incredible amount of vascularization we have in the skin, and this is in the hypodermis as well as the dermis layers of the skin, and just lots and lots of blood flow here. And you can see here's a sweat gland, and so there's a couple of reasons that we increase blood flow to the skin. One is just to get more of that hot blood to the surface of the body so we can radiate the heat. The other is because the sweat that we create is actually extracted from the blood and from the interstitial space, and so this blood that's being sent to these vessels, some of it is being pulled, some of that plasma volume is being pulled out of that blood to get into the sweat glands to be able to be released as heat. So this is kind of the pathway that we see. We see an increase in temperature sensed by the peripheral and central receptors. This causes an increase in sympathetic nervous system stimulation, which leads to vasodilation in the vessels. And this is one key example of when sympathetic nervous system stimulation actually causes vasodilation instead of vasoconstriction. And then we have stimulation of the sweat glands and also those arterioles. And so that stimulates the sweat glands to start producing sweat and pumping it out onto the skin. And as we talked about in the quiz, these structures are much more sensitive to input from central receptors than they are from peripheral receptors. And so this question here, increased blood flow to the skin causes heat to be lost at a greater degree in which of the following ways? So yeah, that's something to kind of think about. But as you start thinking about it, obviously evaporation, because we're sweating more. That one's no problem. Radiation is definitely true too, because if we have more warm blood close to the surface of the skin, then heat radiates out of that blood. Conduction as well, because all of those tissues are touching each other. The blood is touching the vessel walls, which the vessel walls are touching connective tissue. That connective tissue is touching some other connective tissue layers, which is eventually touching the epidermis, which is eventually able to radiate heat out. So we're warming up all of those tissues via conduction, which allows us to radiate more heat. And if there's more heat on the surface, and if we're moving, then we have air moving across our bodies, and that's more convection as well. So all of these things are increased in response to having more blood flow in the skin. But we really see the majority of the improvement in heat loss happening via more sweating, more evaporation. So this is just looking at the effects of exercise in the heat versus the cold. And so, what we see here in a heat versus cold in oxygen uptake, we see greater oxygen need at the same exact intensity of exercise, greater heart rate, the same exact intensity of exercise, okay, more lactate production at the same exact intensity of exercise, and quicker depletion of muscle glycogen. All of these things are happening due to exercise in the heat versus the cold, okay? And so one thing we can say that really summarizes this a lot is that we have exercise in the heat is more stress on the body, which is going to lead to more sympathetic nervous system stimulation. And when we do that, we are having to use more of our anaerobic systems. So that's going to be related to this one, right? More blood lactate produced, more muscle glycogen used, because anaerobic glycolysis is going to tend to use the muscle glycogen instead of blood glucose. And then because it's more stressful on the body, we're going to be using more type 2 fibers, and even in the type 1 fibers that we're using, the hotter those tissues are around, the hotter those fibers are, the less efficient those become, and the more of that ATP is actually lost as heat instead of being used as mechanical energy, and so we become less efficient. And then the heart rate goes up. Part of that is because of more sympathetic nervous system stimulation. Part of that is because we're losing fluid, and so we have less venous return, and so part of that is actually just sweat production and losing fluid that way, but part of it is just more blood flow in the skin and not in our central circulation, so we have less venous return. And so in order to keep cardiac output, the same stroke volume is going down, so we have to increase heart rate to account for that. Okay, so this is just looking at a kind of physiological responses, acute responses to exercise and the heat. And so the key here is that surface blood flow is increased at the expense of other tissue. Okay, so that's one thing, so we're sending more blood flow to the skin, so other tissues do not have as much blood. Okay, so, and then we also have an actual decrease in blood volume because we lose some blood volume via sweating. Okay, so this decreases cardiac efficiency, meaning that stroke volume is going down if we have less blood flow centrally, so heart rate has to go up, so it's more work on the heart. And we see cardiovascular drift, which means the longer we exercise in the heat, even if we're at the same intensity the whole time, our heart rate is slowly going up. We also see increase in oxygen uptake, increased glycogen usage, and fatigue earlier, which is all what we just talked about in the last slide as well. Okay, so as I've talked about before, and as a few of us got to see at the conference we went to up in Orange County, that the human's sweating system is far above and beyond any other animal, and so humans have somewhere around 2 to 5 million sweat glands in the skin, and sweat is mostly all water, 99% water. But if you have a situation where somebody's exercising without sweat, this is what we see. We see an increase in heat production, increase in body temperature by about 2 degrees Celsius per minute, leading to actual thermal injury in 15 to 20 minutes of exercise. And there are a couple conditions in the body where sweating isn't possible, and there are some people that have a disease that sweating doesn't happen, and they literally can't exercise for more than about 5 minutes at a time because their body cannot deal with the heat that's produced by exercise. So sweat obviously comes from the blood. We've been talking about this. The amount of sweat can be pretty extreme. Unacclimatized people can sweat up to about 1.5 liters per hour, which is still a lot. But if you're acclimatized and a heavy sweater, you can sweat up to 4 liters per hour. And remember, we only have about 6 liters of blood in the body, so this just necessitates lots and lots of fluid, taking fluid in order to compensate for this massive loss of fluid with exercise. 4 liters an hour, that's 2 liter bottles an hour. And so this is something that you can just kind of look over, and this just kind of is getting at the heart of this, how much energy we actually produce with exercise, and then how easily we can deal with this energy with sweating. And so this is just looking at a 154-pound person. Maybe they're sweating about 2 liters an hour in a hot, humid environment, but we'll say only about 1 liter of that actually gets evaporated. The other half of it gets just drips off the body and doesn't really help us cool. And so if we have this person exercising for 2.5 hours, this creates about 1,000 watts of metabolic heat production. Okay, so we have 1,000 watts of metabolic heat production we have to deal with. Okay, and so each liter of sweat evaporated per hour results in about 680 watts of heat dissipation. Okay, so that's pretty powerful. And so that's 680 watts per hour times 2.5 hours of exercise. We've actually dissipated 1,700 watts of heat, and this is a definitely a believable example. But since we produced 1,000 watts of heat by the body, but this doesn't include environmental heat. So, but we've actually dissipated 1,700 watts, and so in order to maintain core temperature with this 1,700 watts of heat dissipation, we can see how much fluid we've actually lost. And so 2.5 hours times 2 liters per hour is 5 liters of fluid lost. Okay, so 1 liter of water weight, 1 liter of water weighs about 1 kilogram, and you can see that 2.2 pounds times 5 liters is 11 pounds of water loss in the 2.5 hours. Okay, which is about 7% of body weight. So in order to deal with this exercise for 2.5 hours, this 154-pound person had to lose 7% of their body weight. So obviously this necessitates a major need for fluid replacement with exercise. And this is kind of general guidelines on what occurs with percentage of body weight lost to sweat. And this is without any fluid replacement. So 2%, just a 2% decline is impairs performance. 4% decreases your muscles' capacity for work. At 5%, you're getting into heat exhaustion, where you're definitely not exercising anymore. You're moving towards heat illness. And then 7%, you're starting to have CNS decline and hallucinations. 10% typically is noted the point where you're going to have circulatory collapse, where the heart can't maintain cardiac output anymore, heat stroke, and death. And one of the key things that happens while you have circulatory collapse is this fact that if stroke volume is dropping, heart rate has to go up. And so the heart is working harder and harder and harder to maintain cardiac output like it's shown here. But at some point, this is too much stress on the heart, and you can end up having a heart attack or an arrhythmia, and leading to sudden cardiac death. And this is just looking a little bit at what can happen here. This is a study that was done back in the day when they could get people to exercise for 5 or 6 hours straight and have them do that for research purposes. This is an incredibly intense study that these people did, but what this is showing here is 3 different conditions where at one time the person exercised and they were able to take in as much water as they wanted to. This is their heart rate. Another time they were able to get as much saline infused into their veins as necessary. Another time they had no fluid replacement, and they had them exercise for 6 hours. And you can see heart rate does slowly go up, even in the fluid replacement conditions. But without fluid replacement, you just see an absolute skyrocketing of heart rate, and they don't make it 6 hours. They only make it 5 hours. But you can see there what their heart rate should have been about 130 to maintain this intensity. Their heart rate was at about 165 by the end of 5 hours. And so just incredible cardiac stress due to this lack of fluid replacement. And obviously this is going to be coupled with a decline in physical performance. And so this slide is showing here, the more dehydrated you are, the more decline in performance you see. Okay, and so obviously we're not just losing water, and this is where companies like Gatorade make all their money. Is that there is more than just water being lost, and so one key thing that happens here in the sweat is that sweat that's on the skin is actually hypotonic, but sweat that's out down in the sweat gland, in the coil part of the sweat gland, is going to be actually isotonic or isoosmotic with the fluid, or with the interstitial fluid and with the blood. And so as sweat goes through that gland, through the duct portion of the gland, we pull back some sodium, sodium chloride, and this allows us to save some salt. And the more that we train, the more we do this. And so the more salt we save with training, and this is due to the receptors along the sides of the sweat gland ducts that become more sensitive to aldosterone. And so we reabsorb sodium and chloride, as I mentioned, and the ones that are not reabsorbed are calcium, potassium, and magnesium. But we don't really see much loss of these. And you can see that here, at least with the potassium, there's no change in the amount of potassium reabsorbed, but there is in these other ones, the amount of these electrolytes change quite a bit. So the higher sweat rates, meaning that the faster that the sweat gets pumped through those ducts, the higher rates of these electrolytes are lost, and we have less ability to reabsorb these because the sweat is pumping through so fast we can't absorb them the same. But one thing that's key about these electrolytes that are not reabsorbed is that it's only about 1% of these electrolytes that are lost. And so as far as we know, there's no effect of losing these electrolytes on performance. Now, of course, Gatorade would kind of disagree with this, and that's why they think it's so important that there's calcium and magnesium and potassium in their drinks, but there's really no solid evidence to back up the fact that if we lose these, that causes a decrease in performance. So this is just showing, we're going to talk a little bit about the things that happen when somebody gets acclimated to exercise in the heat. And what we can see here is with exercise someone who's acclimated is going to maintain a cooler core temperature longer. Obviously, that this is the end goal, and also keeping cardiac stress down. So this is someone under the same condition, same amount of fluid replacement, but just someone who's acclimated in the blue, someone who's not acclimated in this purplish pink here. You can see that their heart rate stays lower and their rectal temperature stays lower, and those are the key things that we're trying to maintain and trying to get at with acclimating to the. So we'll talk about a few things that actually happen with heat acclimatization. And so one of the quickest things that happens, and a very important adaptation, is the increase in plasma volume. Okay, we saw this with endurance training, but we also see it with the adaptation to exercising in the heat. And so this happens within the first 1 to 3 days of exercise in the heat. Okay, and we can see about a 12% increase in plasma volume, and this is very, very, very important. And so the same, just like we see with aerobic endurance training, we see an increase in plasma proteins in the blood, and this allows for more water to stay in the blood because we have the higher osmotic pressure in the blood. And so the liver can upregulate the production of these plasma proteins pretty quickly in response to exercise in the heat, and this allows us to maintain more blood volume. Obviously, we just have to drink more fluids in order to give the body the fluid it needs to put this into the blood. So that one happens very quick. But we also get improvements in the sweating mechanism. Okay, and so some of the things we see is we see sweating starting earlier in an exercise bout and at a little bit lower temperature than before. We get more sweat, and as I said, some people can sweat up to 4 liters per hour, and we get more dilute sweat. So the sweat, more of those electrolytes are pulled back in the sweat glands. And another thing that's interesting is we get sweat increases in the arms and the legs, and so this has been shown that you get more sweating on the areas that are more likely to be exposed to the air, which is really interesting and very good adaptation. The more, since there's going to be air passing over those and more convection happening there, that's going to help with evaporation, and so we get more sweating in those areas. Also, we get an increase in the blood flow to the skin. And so one of the things that we learned at the conference we went to back in October was that one thing we see in sweat glands is we actually see hypertrophy of sweat glands. And so that big coiled section of the sweat gland that you see there in the slides that shows the skin with the sweat gland, that actually increases, and we get larger sweat glands, and that's definitely related to how much sweat you can have, and also the dilute sweat too, because that we get more of the proteins there that are responsible for pulling back the sodium. So we actually can hypertrophy our sweat glands, which was something I learned at that conference, which was pretty interesting. These changes take a little bit longer. This is probably more a week and a half to 2 weeks until we start seeing this. So yeah, just to summarize that, we get the 2 major changes we see with sweating improvements are, one, we see the increase in plasma volume, which happens in 1 to 3 days, and then we see the increase in our sweating mechanism with all the changes that were listed there. That usually occurs within 10 to 14 days of exercise in the heat. Okay, and so we're going to get into fluid replacement next, and I'm going to leave this until next time. We'll start the class on Wednesday with this. All right, thanks for listening, guys. We'll see you on Wednesday.